Yesterday in the Guardian, which is one of the leading newspapers in the United Kingdom, there was this striking headline: Canada urged to quell discrimination against women after fall in UN ranking. I read the story and found out that at this time each year, the UN comes out with something called the Gender Inequality Index, which are a series of statistics that they compile for countries across the world where they look at reproductive health, empowerment, and economic inclusion. And one of the things that was noted in that article was that Canada in 1995 was first globally in the gender index. In other words, we had the best conditions in terms of those statistics. Today, we're 25th. So I immediately thought about that, what happened? And I thought back to the Minister of the Status of Women in 2008, Bev Oda, declaring in Parliament, in the House of Commons, we're all equal now. And one of the reasons she declared that was because in the last decade, the government that was at the helm decided that they would no longer cater to women's special interests, that we would all be treated the same, and that we would no longer be doing what was called gender-based analysis. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. How many people have heard of gender budgeting or gender-responsive budgeting? Probably nobody. Well, it's an idea that came out of feminist economics, yes, that exists, and also out of the women's movement and out of different universities and other groups, where the idea was to make a better set of economic policies by actually targeting public spending to gender equality commitments. Now, what is gender budgeting? It's definitely not a budget for women and girls. It's not a separate budget. It's not a budget that says women should have 50%, men should have 50%. What it really is a way of analyzing the big picture economic policies in a way that targets the needs of everybody and recognizes that different groups of women are situated in a different place in the economy and society than different groups of men. So for instance, in Canada today, the wage gap between women and men in the workplace remains, with the gap for full-time workers, annual earnings at 72 cents, and hourly wages at 87 cents. There's also something called the motherhood tax, where economists have shown that women who have children earn 12% less than women who are in a similar place in a job that don't have children. And of course, if we look at the picture for Indigenous women, that's an even more serious situation. So these are some of the questions we would ask if we were doing gender-responsive budgeting. And very importantly, I think these questions are built on a number of premises that come directly out of feminist economics. One of the important premises is that the public budget is actually something that is a value-related document, and it's not just something that's technical. It's very much political. Secondly, we know that unpaid work like childcare, household work, and care for the elderly, as well as volunteer work, are all essential for the functioning of the rest of the economy. Yet we still know that there is a persistent gender division of labor, with, for example, in 2010, women spending about 13.8 hours a week on those activities, and men 8.3 hours. So this is why people who do gender responsive budgeting make an argument that we need to also measure time, especially time in unpaid work, because time is a resource just like everything else, and we should include this. In other words, what we don't measure, we don't treasure. So it's very important from this vantage point of a gender responsive budget that we make visible to public policy the full range of activities that we all encounter in our lives. Well, why do gender budgeting? First first of all, if you were talking to a conventional economist, it's usually a he, would say to you, look, that's all great what you're talking about, but macroeconomics isn't about people. It's about the big picture. It's about growth, it's about employment, it's about trade flows, and people who do social policy, they can talk about people. What gender-responsive budgeting tells us, though, is that all the policy decisions that are made at this big level of tax cuts or where to invest in infrastructure, those have very much social implications for the distribution of jobs in society, for the distribution of income, and other matters. Okay, so it's very important then to include that kind of an analysis when you're doing gender-based budgeting, and also to include in the analysis a recognition that labor, which is one of the key factors of production in every economy, is something that's produced outside of the formal economy. Most people just assume that you arrive at the workplace, don't take into account the kind of education that you've had, what's gone into that, and how labor has been nurtured and sustained in the household. So an additional factor aside from unpaid work for those who are doing gender responsive budgeting is to actually say, look, we have to look at labor as both a product of the money economy, because when somebody earns a wage, they can buy food, they can buy shelter, but also a product of unpaid labor time, because they have to make that food into a meal, they have to keep a neat house, etc. So just to summarize so far, the picture that you see here is a dancer on the back of the Bull of Wall Street, and this was actually the symbol for the Occupy movement, which you might remember was protesting against the 1% and the kind of huge inequalities in wealth and income. In a way, I think it's a nice image because it captures both the seriousness of the questions, but also some of the fun. And I think that people who do gender budgeting in real life always have in mind these two aspects. And their critique of existing policy is, as you can see on the slide, that it focuses much too much on narrow goals, as I've just tried to explain. It has a very biased view of what is public investment. For example, public investment is if the government gives money to a construction company to build a school, and that construction company buys materials, hires workers. That's considered a public investment. But once the doors to that school open and teachers are hired, they're considered to be a current expenditure, even though they don't just teach day to day, but have a very long-term impact in terms of the economy. And of course, as I've already said, unpaid work is very important to take into account. And here you can see a chart that gives you some idea of what the economy would actually look like if we did value household production. We'd have a very different picture of the economy. This basically shows you what percentage of household production is part of GDP if you were to hire somebody to do that work. Now this next picture I put in for two reasons. One, you have some of the benefits of gender-based budgeting that have been argued for in the European Union, for example, where quite a few countries have started to undertake this kind of planning exercise. But I also wanted to show you this picture, which is a photo of the last G7 meeting of economic and finance ministers in Japan. And I think what's pretty striking is that it's a lot of guys, a lot of white guys who come from finance and from banking. And there are two women in this picture, Christine Lagarde, who is the managing director of the IMF, and Janet Yellen, who is the director of the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank. What's striking about the picture is not just the absence of other women, but of course the absence of diversity of racialized groups. And if we were to really start to probe into how decisions are made about economic policies, especially monetary policies, I think what would be striking to everybody is how narrow the viewpoints are that are expressed around that table. So there's a mantra about, keeping deficits down, cutting spending, all of these things that we're all familiar with in the last couple of years, and there's not much questioning of alternatives. This led some people to remark when the financial crisis hit in 2007, 2008, that if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Sisters, maybe things would have turned out differently. And here the argument is that women are less risk averse generally, and that they have a much deeper understanding of the impacts of economic crisis on everyday life. I think that there's some research that supports that, but I think we have to also be careful not to reduce everything to individual characteristics and to step back and actually look at the structures that are built into the system that produce maximum returns. They force people to produce maximum returns in the shortest possible period of time. Now, I'm not going to teach you how to do gender budgeting, but I just wanted to show you that there's actually no one way to do it, and women's groups or different governments do different things. But certainly what you have to do first is you have to make gender visible. So you have to bring it to the table as part of the discussion, and you have to have proper statistics in employment and food security, poverty, so that you can make informed decisions. At the end of that circle, you can see a gender budget statement. And I'm going to suggest to you that I think a first good step in terms of doing gender budgeting is to do a gender budget statement. And this is in fact what some of us are pressuring the Trudeau government to do for their next budget. And really what that is it's a statement that's part of the official budget, and it might take one really important area of government policy, such as infrastructure, which you might know that the Liberal government has promised to spend in the next 10 years $120 billion. So a very, very large amount, and ask them to look at all aspects of how they plan to do that spending, and to look at the impacts it's going to have on employment, on different types of infrastructure, and on public services, which women, especially poor women, tend to rely on much more than men. Now, there's about 80 countries plus around the world that are doing gender budgeting. And one of the best examples comes from the UK. They have a really excellent website that I would direct you to. They have been doing this kind of analysis since the late 80s. And in particular, what you see here on this slide is an analysis that they've been doing since a Conservative government came in 2010. It was first a coalition government and then a Conservative government, where they decided to pursue austerity. I think everybody knows what that means, belt tightening and so forth. But what they did was they actually analyzed who's tightening their belts and what kind of impact is this having socially. And you can see here that overwhelmingly different types of women and female-headed households were bearing the brunt of the adjustment to austerity. And that's because where benefits were cut and where taxes were cut benefited women and men disproportionately. Now, we've done some work in Canada. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. These are done by academics. One is by Kathleen Leahy, who's a tax lawyer at Queen's, and she looked at tax cuts in the 2012 budget. We're always hearing that's a good thing. And one of the things that she discovered was that if you looked at the least regressive type of tax cut, in other words, the least kind of unequal tax cut overall, that men would benefit 60% from those tax cuts and women 40%, largely because of the differential in income. And the second one is by a colleague of mine, Brenda Spotton-Visano, who looked at the 2010 federal budget and very interestingly looked at the infrastructure spending. And you can see from the chart here that where men work and where women work in terms of infrastructure spending is very disproportionate. So there's very few women that are going to benefit from straight out infrastructure spending. That's why it's so important to think about it in terms of the $120 billion that is now being promised by this government. So what can you do? Well, one of the things that would be very helpful is to write to the Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, and the Minister for the Status of Women, urging them to prepare a women's budget statement. Secondly, you could form your own women's budget group. It could be for something very small, an issue, a policy that affects you very directly, and do your own analysis. And thirdly, you could write an op-ed, again, on something that directly affects you and that you know of others who are affected by that policy, and you might feel that had they done a gender-based analysis of the situation, then the outcome would have been different. So those are just some suggestions for you. Thanks.